will go ahead and introduce Megan Faye, who is talking about the impact of early childhood trauma in the Harry Potter series.
Thank you. So I'm very excited to be here today. I love Harry Potter, and I love trying to relate it to other areas of my life, my passions. And so in the Muggle world, I am the coordinator of a trauma program. We provide services for people who are incarcerated with diagnosed mental illness related to trauma. I wish I could say I was up here about to do a presentation on mental health healers in Azkaban, but to my devastation, that was not in the series. Actually, mental health treatment in general wasn't really depicted very well in the series. There were some mentions. The kids, if they were having a hard time with exams, could go to Madame Pomfrey for an anxiety or sleeping drought. You can see, with Neville's parents, we see them, but their inpatient treatment seems pretty minimal. They're there for years. There's very little improvement. There's not any mental health specific therapy, treatment, providers, anything like that discussed. They also never really name or discuss mental health. We see it in the series, but they don't actually talk about it. But we definitely see it, and we definitely, if there's one thing present that we see within mental health, it is childhood trauma in Harry Potter. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, even though it's not specifically named. And first, I just want to define what I'm talking about when I say trauma. We can use a lot of different definitions, descriptions. Because I'm a clinical psychologist, I tend to use the clinical definition. So when you're diagnosing a trauma-related disorder, this would be the kind of descriptions you're looking for, something that has to do with actual or threatened serious injury, death, sexual assault, could be perceived, witnessed. We're not going to get too much into the weeds. I just wanted to address what I was talking about when I say trauma. And we're also going to talk about how it impacts people. So a lot of these characters experience traumatic events. That doesn't mean that all of them have symptoms of trauma or mental illness. Not all of them are going to experience everything as traumatic. So we're going to go through some different characters and kind of see how maybe they develop, how they respond to trauma. The other thing I'm going to talk about is more broadly than just that very clinical definition of trauma. We're also looking at adverse childhood experiences. If people aren't familiar with that term, it is just to help encapsulate events and circumstances that can cause long-term chronic stress, but aren't underneath that specific trauma definition. And you're going to see what a lot of those are on the next slide. But there has been a lot of research on adverse childhood experiences. Normally, in the Muggle world, we would define childhood as anything underneath 18. When I'm talking, I'm going to do it under 17, since 17 is their age of adulthood, and those are their characters. And then we're also going to look at a specific scale for that, because again, there are so many different things you can look at. And don't worry, we're going to go through these really quickly, and then I'll get right back to Harry Potter for anyone who is having a hard time. This is the scale that I actually use in it's all the federal systems actually for prisons use this scale. It is very commonly used since, you can see, 1998 when it was developed. And these are the adverse childhood experiences that they're looking at. Some of them would meet trauma, some of them don't. And again, don't worry about memorizing this and the next few slides. I'm going to pop up with each character so we can look at them. That way you don't need to try to memorize or write any of this down. And I'm also, when we're looking at the characters, I wanted to say that I will only be using evidence from the 7 books in the series. If you want on your own to talk about it with the movies or spin-offs or canon, anything going on, that's fine. But I will only be accepting the original 7 books as factual evidence and data. These are the kind of outcomes I'm going to look at. There are way more in research, but I just tried to group them into some of the categories. I put behaviors in quotation because they talk about these things as behaviors in a lot of the outcome research. But just from working with incarcerated folks, I know that if you talk about some of these things like being incarcerated as a behavior, there's kind of an insinuation that they had a choice in that, and that it's too simplistic, it puts some blame, some shame on it, which just isn't helpful for treatment and isn't always true. So I wanted to recognize that. And then these are some of the resiliency factors that we teach in, I do a workshop where we teach about resiliency, and these are the ones that I talk about most commonly. So again, those will pop up. Do not memorize them. Today we're going to look and see, kind of answer the question, does the Muggle research generalize to the wizarding world? So do we see what we would expect based on research with the characters? I thought that was kind of an interesting way to look at mental health since they don't actually talk about it. I'm going to start off with Harry Potter. I circled my opinion, but it is a little bit objective. I'm trying to go off what I can only see in the book and not my own assumptions. I'm sure some people could try to argue different points, but I did compare with some other clinical psychologists to see what they thought, get a sample. So I gave him an ACE score of 8, which is very high. So again, you can look at different cutoffs, but normally in research, a 3 or a 4 is the cutoff. Anything 3 or higher that you're looking at for high likelihood of some negative later life outcomes. And in the prison system, anything higher than a 3 or higher automatically refers you for trauma programming for mental health. Yes? Would you mind reading just a couple of examples? Oh, of course, sorry. No problem. I can read all of them. That's not an issue, since we're going to talk about all of them. So the first one is, oh, and I should say, just as a trigger warning too, I'm reading these out, but they are all trauma adverse experiences, just the definitions. When you were growing up, did a parent or adult in your family often say things that put you down or humiliate you? Often do things that made you afraid of getting hurt? If you circle either one of those as yes, it means the whole thing is true. So you only have to have one of those be right. When you were growing up, did a parent or adult in your family often push, grab, slap, or throw things at you? Ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Again, if you circle either one of those, that would be the physical abuse. When you were growing up, did an adult or child older than 5, and I won't read all these definitions out, but this is about sexual assault, and we actually do not have any of the characters who have this one, so I don't know that it's necessary to read all of them out, and that could be triggering for some people. The next question is, when you were growing up, did it often seem that no one in your family loved or cared about you, or that your family didn't stick together or support each other? The next one is on lack of basic needs. When you were growing up, did you often feel that you didn't have enough to eat? You didn't have to, or you had to wear dirty clothes. You didn't have clean clothes. You had no one to protect you, or the adults who cared for you were too drunk or high to take care of you or bring you to the doctor. The next one is, when you were growing up, did you lose a biological parent due to divorce, abandonment, or another reason? The next question is about domestic violence in the home. When you were growing up, was your mother or the woman who cared for you physically abused? There's one about substance use in the home. So when you were growing up, did you ever live with someone who had a drinking problem or who used drugs illegally? When you were growing up, did you ever live with someone who attempted suicide or had a serious mental problem? And when you were growing up, did you ever live with anyone who went to prison or Azkaban? And for the mental problem one, when I talk about that, again, because they didn't diagnose anything, I'm going to be really careful. I think it's easy to look at some of these characters and their families and say, like, oh, there's something wrong with them. But I want to be careful with that, because I think that equating someone being evil or abusive or not kind with mental illness is not something that we probably want to do. So we're going to steer clear of that. In any case, for Harry, I gave him an ACE score of 8. I said that he was emotionally and physically abused, he was neglected, he didn't always have his basic needs met, he lost his parents. For the domestic violence one, he was 1 year old when his mother was murdered in front of him, and he does have memories of that, so I actually did include that one, yes. We discussed that. Not everybody agreed with that one, so think about it for yourself. I also said that he witnessed somebody who had serious mental health. For that one, I was actually thinking about serious. Even though the Dursleys' home was the one where he had to be able to call it home, I did for Harry also consider Grimmauld Place and the Weasleys as potential home environments. He spent, for him, a significant amount of time there in the summer, and he seemed to think of those places as home and those people as family, or given family, chosen family. So I included that one for him. And then, were you ever living with someone who went to prison? Again, I counted serious being incarcerated. Yes, it's for people who were in your home, who live with you, though. So for outcomes, I just underlined some of the ones that I saw for him. Harry Potter had a lot of outcomes, which makes sense. He has the highest ACE score of any of the characters I'll show, just as a sneak peek. So it makes sense that he has a lot of outcomes in the book. I said chronic pain because he deals with the headaches from his scar a lot. He also had a lot of relationship issues. He struggled with isolation and withdrawal. He had friends, but you can see what is clearly some symptoms, some responses to trauma. Trust issues, fears of abandonment. There's a section from the books where Dumbledore says that he's going to come and pick Harry up. And instead of being excited about that, Harry spends the entire time thinking, he's not going to do it. What will I do? How am I going to get through this? When he doesn't come pick me up, how should I cope with it? He doesn't even pack his bags because he does not trust that an adult is actually going to come and get him. And in those moments, I think you see a lot of his trust and abandonment difficulties. For mental health, again, he's not diagnosed, so I'm not going to say specifically what, but I think it's clear that Harry struggles with his mental health at some points during the book, which makes sense. He has a lot of trauma. Difficulty with regulating his emotions. So for that, I'm thinking of moments like in the 5th book when he starts having a lot of anger and having some outlashing, kind of difficulty controlling and regulating his emotions. That's really normal for someone his age in that book, for teenagers going through a tough time. So I don't want to completely over-pathologize that behavior, but I do think you can see how it's connected to his trauma and how he struggles with regulating some of those emotions. For behaviors, I actually presented here once before a few years ago, and for that one, I went through all the books and tallied every act that could be considered violence, and then I looked at the people who were the biggest perpetrators of violence. And Harry actually, it turned out to be one of the largest perpetrators throughout the book. So he had 17 acts of violence that I counted throughout the series. And I should say I didn't count acts towards animals, which if I went through it again, I would. So that might change some of their scores. But he did have some aggressive and violent behaviors. I underlined incarceration. He wasn't actually ever incarcerated, but he was involved with the justice system as a teenager, which is an outcome that we look at sometimes. He did not for the others, because I'm only using the 7 books, I can't say anything about his employment. And he did all right academically. When you look at his resiliency factors, I think that these account for a lot of why you don't see even worse trauma responses and behavioral issues with Harry. Because even though there were a lot of things underlined there, he actually does pretty well. He functions well, he has friends, he plays sports, and a lot of that is what helps him do that. He has coping skills, he has athletics, he has friends, community supports, family members who found family, people like Mrs. Weasley who kind of take on that motherly role. He does, for the most part, sometimes he struggles with nightmares and sleep, but he gets pretty good sleep. He doesn't have food at the Dursleys, but a resiliency factor is that the entire time he's at Hogwarts or other people's houses, he does get those kinds of medical treatment, eating. Any questions about Harry, just when we're looking at outcomes? I actually think that he's pretty realistically portrayed for somebody who did not author well talking about mental health. She did show him really struggling in some of those outcomes. Ron and Hermione would be pretty quick. We're going to fly through them because they both have an ACE score of 0. Lucky ducks. And they both, Ron, I said he had some issues with self-esteem. Again, pretty normal for him in his developmental period, but it does seem like it's becoming a part of the core of how he perceives himself. That could change as he grows up, but I did underline that one. And he had a lot of good coping skills, social support, community. He never struggled with sleeping or eating in the Weasley house. For Hermione, again, I gave her an ACE score of 0. She did pretty well. She actually, surprise, was a perpetrator of violence that I talked about in my last presentation. She had 8 acts throughout the series. I think people don't always think about her that way, but she actually did have a lot of outbursts where she was aggressively punching different characters, hitting them, doing things like that. And she had a ton of great coping skills, social support, hope, purpose. Neville had 4 to 5, depending on how you look at them. I didn't score the one about if your family supported or loved or cared about you, because I thought that was kind of his perception, and it was hard for me to answer that. There were moments in the book where he seemed to have a solid support from his grandmother, and moments where he seemed shocked and surprised that she would say or think something nice of him, or show up in different ways for him. So I didn't know exactly what he would say if he were to answer that one. So 4 to 5. And I'm not going to go through these, but these were just the quotes I used when I was looking at the different types of abuse. So when he's describing how his uncle Algie kept pushing him off of, rooftops into different lakes, he almost drowned, and he's describing other people just casually being around, not alarmed by this behavior, that he could be seriously injured or die from these events. To me, I counted that as instances of physical and emotional abuse. And again, he did actually pretty well for someone with such a high ACE score. He had some social isolation and some low self-esteem, and he might have had mental health, we don't know. In general, though, he actually ended up doing pretty well for himself, and I think a huge part of that was his ability to find places that he was skilled, to find people like Professor McGonagall, who was willing to speak up for him and help him actually pursue his skills. We only have a few more minutes, so I did a ton of characters just in case someone was interested. I'll do one more. Would you guys want to hear about Draco, Dumbledore? I did Severus, Tom Riddle, Sirius. Who do you want to hear about? Dumbledore? Okay. Draco had 2, Sirius 3, 5, just so you can quickly see those. Severus, I gave a score of 3, 4, because there was a lot you didn't see in the books. I feel like there's a lot under the surface we didn't learn about his childhood, so I put a question mark next to the 3. I also did Merrob Gaunt. She was very interesting, and I thought she was interesting as a character because she is the only person I would identify in that series who was depicted sexually assaulting someone. So as a person who committed a sex offense, I thought she was very interesting to study. Albus Dumbledore, I gave him an ACE score of 3. I said that he lost a parent growing up. His father, in the books, they say that he was sent to Azkaban, where he later died. They don't actually mention in the books when that was, but he doesn't seem to be a presence, and when Dumbledore is 17, he has to take over the entire family when his mom passes. So it does appear that his father was completely out of the picture. So I counted his father for that. I did not count his mother as passing away because she passed when he was 17, which as a wizard would be his adulthood, and these are only for children. And then I looked at living with someone who had serious mental health. I talked about his sister for that. Growing up with someone who was incarcerated, that would be his father. For outcomes, I would say relationships is pretty serious. He had a lot of friends and people who liked him, but it seemed like he invested more in, a 12-year-old boy than he did in adults his own age, than having healthy relationships with others. He definitely seemed to have some difficulties with trust, with communication, with control, definitely some abusive behaviors. He was not somebody who showed up in my perpetrator list because it was hard to find instances where he was specifically physically or emotionally harming people. It was more about a complete neglect and lack of willingness to protect others. And then just a quick, before we get to questions, to show you Tom Riddle, because I feel like people would be interested in him. He did have a lot of aces, but not as many as I might expect for somebody who murdered that many people. I looked at the caregiver, the headmistress of the orphanage, as potentially being a person in his home who he saw substances with, just based on the extreme gin drinking she was doing in the afternoon in that book in front of a professor in an interview. Seemed concerning to me. And then some possible neglect, and it was grim, but he actually was taken care of for his basic needs. There was no sign that he was physically abused. I think a lot of that is missing from some of it. So he actually, I think just a lack of resiliency factors played a big role for him.